Welcome to our very first module for team leadership. I'm so excited that you're here, and I hope that everything you've learned in our self leadership course will help bolster your learning here. This is going to be all about integrating it in a team environment and helping other people self lead as well. So let's dig in and get a little bit of an overview of what each of the elements are going to look like. So, our typical learning objectives, we're going to define what team leadership is for the purpose of this course. We're going to talk about what it looks like in practice with a broad overview of in balance and out of balance for each of the elements. Talk about why those matter for leadership and how to start integrating them now. You can pick something and start working with it, and then we'll dig into the first element next week. So we use the same bad definition of leadership through all of our courses because really fundamentally a lot of people think this is what leadership is. It's telling other people what to do and getting them to do it. Ultimately say I pay them for a job, I want them to do that job. And that's really what a lot of people think leadership is all about. But as we already know, it's so much more than that, especially among teams. And for our purposes, the definition of team leadership is going to be facilitating positive, interdependent relationships with mutual respect, consideration, and support. Imagine working on that team. That's the team that I want to sign up for. And we're going to talk about how to build it. So back to our old tennis analogy, which I know you just looked at when you finished your self leadership course, but still, relationships are like tennis games. So now, hopefully, you've kind of mastered, or you're getting to the point where you can respond instead of just reacting, so that now you can mindfully hit the ball in such a way that it impacts the response of the other player mindfully so that you can help them ultimately become self leaders. And team leadership is the ability to model and inspire self leadership in all team members so that each person is bringing their best serve to the game. Now, of course, this is assuming that you're not playing with an opponent, that you're playing with someone who you're trying to help make a better player. So let's just, acknowledge that now. So we're familiar with these old examples, right? This old rhetoric that we often hear from leaders typically who are stressed out, right? That the stress associated with leadership can lead leaders to say things like this: just do it, just figure it out. I pay you to do a job, do the job, right? You did it wrong. Typically it's you did it wrong again. Now let's spend the next 40 minutes talking about why you did it wrong. And you're underperforming. You're underperforming, your job's on the line, whatever that might be. But the point is, a lot of the focus is on what's not working well. And a lot of the emphasis is put on you to figure it out. And then there's typically claims of like, well, I'm going to support you, but nobody really knows what that looks like, and there's not a lot of follow through. And I know that I'm painting a very bleak picture of leadership. I get it. This is pretty common. Maybe it's just the leaders that I've come into contact with. And a lot of my leaders don't do this on a regular basis, right? It's only when they're really stressed out and they don't know how else to fix it. But I'm going to show you some alternative ways to fix it and to create a culture that's based on social safety. We're going to talk about social safety a lot. First, we talked about why it's important to be a self leader who models social safety for yourself and within yourself. And now we're going to talk about why it's so important to create that across your team and how you can communicate with social safety. So let's look at the five elements of self leadership. All right, so first we have empathy. Empathy is a really hot word right now. We're going to dig into what it means for our purposes to help facilitate the rest of these elements of team leadership. Because then we have gratitude, consent, clarity, and boundaries. Now, I know consent is kind of a hot button word as well. We're not talking about sexual harassment, okay? Although, if we do have an environment, a culture of consent, things like sexual harassment will happen few and far between. It's just truth. Okay. So, real quick, empathy. Again, we're going to dig into it a lot deeper next week. But empathy, when it's out of balance, a leader's typically out of touch. They're highly critical. They tend to be narcissistic. It's kind of all about what people can do for them. And that creates a culture of fear. But when empathy is in balance, leaders are tuned in, they see, they hear, they feel into their staff. They they're they recognize their feelings. They recognize that they have feelings, and they are encouraging and lift them up as opposed to being critical and kind of put them down. And they're typically in a leader that emphasizes empathy, or that it's high, that exhibits, man, a leader that is high on the empathy scale. I'm just going to keep rolling with it. They are somebody who demonstrates a lot of service, right? They get down and dirty with the people with whom they're working. So they don't mind doing the grunt work, because the grunt work is important, and they see the people who have menial tasks, or the kind of invisible people, and that's really important. And they collaborate. They collaborate with each other. They're open to new ideas. They want to collaborate with you. They want to know, hey, do you have ideas that are better than mine? Where do they come from? They want to tune in. And in summary, empathy increases engagement like a lot. When people feel seen, when they feel heard, when they feel understood and cared for, it makes the whole team feel more like a tribe. And you want to perform well for our tribe. Remember how we learned that in the, social evaluative threat a few modules ago? When people feel like it's a tribe and everyone's tuned in, they want to do well. They want to perform well, which helps facilitate gratitude. So, with gratitude, when it's out of balance, there tends to be a fear of failure, because there's so much emphasis on what's going wrong and not enough emphasis on what's going right. So that leaves people feeling really dejected, like they're never good enough. They can do 99.9 things right, and the leader will see the point 0.9 or 0.1% that is bad, right? And then focus on that for the next 40 minutes of the review. So they just never feel good enough. They never, and then everything is just too serious. It's not any fun. There's not any room for creativity, not any room for error. But when gratitude is in balance, then teams typically feel very confident and creative. They feel empowered, and they're focused on just getting progressively better, because gratitude is displayed along the way, or gratitude is shown along the way for each little micro step and micro improvement that they make. And that creates a very light-hearted, fun, and humorous atmosphere, because it's fun to be creative, right? It's fun to play. It's fun to think about new ideas, and it's really fun to be seen and rewarded or acknowledged for those new ideas. So, in summary, gratitude is the antidote to complacency. If empathy helps people engage, gratitude is like one ups that, right? It helps them stay engaged and get even more engaged. It's a really, really great tool. And then there is consent. So consent is all about asking for openness. Are you open? It's asking for the buy-in. It's asking if it's okay, and checking the person's values and boundaries. When it's out of balance, there's a lot of lecturing, a lot of conflict that happens, right? So it might be unsolicited advice or unsolicited opinions that can create conflict and trigger somebody else, unsolicited fixing. When consent is out of balance, there are a lot of assumptions that are made, and sometimes the assumption is, oh, well, of course you can work extra hours this week because the goal is important to you, right? And that creates a pressure cooker. And pressure cookers are not fun to work in. But when consent is in balance, there's more conversation, because there's more questions and then listening to the questions. There's back and forth. And that provides a great framework for compromise. So people can compromise with each other and say, well, I can't do that, but I can do this. Or what are some other ideas that you have? Because I'm not comfortable going there, but I'm comfortable with this. Okay. And then as a leader, when you start that conversation and you learn where everybody's at, where their strengths are, where their values are, where their comfort zones are, and where they're willing to expand outside of their comfort zones, then you're able to step back and just facilitate. You don't have to continue to drive the train. They will self lead and drive themselves. And then you see everybody start to thrive because they are autonomous. Consent is also a very, very powerful tool. And most importantly, it creates an environment of respect where people are demonstrating respect for each other. That's what consent does. And then clarity, the most common issue that my executives come to me with. They say, "Oh, did we all even go to the same meeting?" Or, "Oh gosh, like I don't know how much clearer I can possibly be. They still don't get it." And they're genuinely frustrated and they're genuinely trying, but they are just giving way too many directives and not asking enough questions. They're making assumptions, but these aren't assumptions about whether or not it's okay. These are assumptions about whether or not you understand, or whether or not like a staff member sees it from the same perspective as the leader. And often there is a very narrow focus and many, many misunderstandings. So narrow focus pops up here as well, but more so that it means we're not thinking about the big picture and the vision. So when clarity is in balance, more open ended questions happen like, well, how do you think about this? How would you improve upon that idea? A lot of thinking, a lot of idea generation, and a lot of listening. And listening with the intention to actually implement that person's ideas, not just as a show. And that happens sometimes. Big picture thinking also shows up when clarity is in balance, where leaders kind of can zoom out and convey the vision, or help people help understand other people's perceptions of the vision. So everyone is really on the same page. And that provides think sync, where everyone is just on the same page and you can step out and trust that they're going to do whatever they need to do to fulfill the ultimate vision and the ultimate objective. And a really important summary, maybe my favorite summary in the entire Leadership Institute, is that clarity comes from the question. Clarity does not come from the directions. Clarity comes from the question. So if you want to be clear, then you have to ask another person's understanding of what they heard. And again, we're going to dig into this a lot more in the clarity module. I just get really excited about it. Then boundaries. When we are in a culture where boundaries are out of balance, oftentimes, the leader's mood rules the world, right? Is he in a good mood today? And it ends up being very unpredictable. If people aren't aware of their boundaries, or they're not aware of their values, and they're not able to communicate their needs and then enforce them, it kind of feels like an invisible fence that shocks you, and it's like a constant moving target. And then that can make people really passive aggressive, right? Because they didn't tell you the boundary, but you crossed the boundary, and then now they're pissed off about it, but they don't really know how to tell you that they're pissed off about it, so they just have a bad attitude. And so not having open, acknowledged boundaries in an organization or in a culture can create a bad attitude. And then an obvious one is when boundaries are out of balance, no is disrespected, or no is maybe not outright disrespected, but you try to push the limit of where the no is. Like, well, would you do this? Well, would you do this version of this? Okay, well, no. And there also ends up being a lot of codependencies, because people who struggle setting boundaries often are people pleasers. And so they'll take on way too much for affirmation, or to endear themselves to the moody leader, and then that creates an environment of codependency. But when boundaries are in balance, then it's a very predictable, safe environment where everybody kind of knows each other's values. And if they don't, they can speak up and acknowledge them, and other people will respect them. So when it's in balance, people are can convey their needs. Everyone respects no and says, all right, the answer is no, we're going to find a different way. And that helps everyone be interdependent, right? I don't, it's okay if you say no to me. We will still figure it out, because I'm independent and autonomous and you're independent and autonomous. Boundaries are a really cool way to help your your culture and your team really thrive, because they encourage candor and social safety. So everyone feels safe, and to talk about, you know, even the touchy sensitive subjects, right? The subjects that say, I'm just not really comfortable with that, or what, that's just beyond my comfort zone. And it doesn't have to be, something inappropriate. It can just be like, I'm not willing to work late, and that's okay too, or I'm not willing to work on that holiday. But so in general, right? So we zoom back out. The self talk of team leadership sounds like I lead others through example, coaching, and a high level of respect in order to facilitate team wide autonomy and emotional well being. Now, obviously, you're not going to say these words to yourself, but this is the essence, right, of what the self talk sounds like, of what it feels like to be a leader that is leading with all of these five elements in balance. So, who would you rather work for? A leader with a team approach or a leader without a team approach? So, without a team approach, without using these five elements of team leadership, they're probably going to be out of touch as opposed to tuned in and seen, and really connecting with their staff. They'll probably create a pressure cooker instead of a safe environment that helps their team thrive. They'll make a lot of assumptions about what's okay instead of asking and listening, really listening. uh, Staff will often feel like they're taken for granted versus working for a leader who demonstrates appreciation. I mean, who would you rather work for, right? Someone who makes you feel like you're taken for granted or someone who demonstrates appreciation? And do you want to work for someone who disrespects disrespects you when you say no and keeps pushing you, or who just takes no as no and is okay with that and finds another way, and someone who creates conflict or someone who facilitates compromise? I'm sure it's kind of an obvious question. This slide's a little rhetorical, but I'm sure you'd rather work for the person with the team approach. So again, the five elements of team leadership. Next week, we start with empathy, then gratitude, consent, clarity, and boundaries. And these are in a very specific order because, from my perspective, you need the first one to build on the next and to really understand it. So hopefully by number five, by boundaries, it will be just like, oh yeah, well duh, that makes sense to me now, even though it didn't 5 weeks ago. So again, that typical old definition of leadership of telling other people what to do and getting them to do it, it's so limiting. Really, leadership can be so much more, especially team leadership. And our definition for the next few weeks will be facilitating positive, interdependent relationships with mutual respect, consideration, and support. And one more time, because I know it was a little wordy, self talk sounds like I lead others through example. So I show up as a self leader, right? Coaching, so you ask questions and listen, and a high level of respect, asking for consent and respecting boundaries in order to facilitate team wide autonomy and emotional well being, AKA social safety. All right, so we define team leadership. We talked about what it looks like in practice. We got a lot of work ahead of us the next few weeks, a lot of change that I'm super excited. And I hope you just say, bring it on, let's go, let's dig into it. And we've talked about why it matters to take this team approach for leadership. Who would you rather work for? So let's talk about integration. So your coaching toolkit, the team leadership questions for this week. First question: how often do you tell your team what they did well and how it helped you meet the overall objective? This is going to set you up really well for gratitude, and it's going to also help set you up for any of the modules that talk about big picture thinking or vision. So, in the next lesson, you'll be able to answer that question and journal about it for a little bit to really think about it. Question number two: how often do you ask your team how they could improve upon your idea? Honestly, this is my absolute favorite question to ask my staff. I ask them, all right, here's my idea. How would you make it better? And they love it because, and the truth is, a lot of times they do make it better. Like more often than not, they have a way better idea than I do, you guys. I mean, I'm saying that honestly. And I think my ideas are pretty good, but they have the clarity of distance and from seeing it from another perspective. And so they can improve upon your ideas. And when they give a better idea and then they take ownership of it, that's really exciting and they get really engaged. And that's what you want. And that makes work fun for everybody, including them and including you. And it makes it easier to lead. And then they can self lead. It's kind of a win 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 win. Okay, number three: how well do you know the personal values of each team member? And have you ever spoken about it? So if you guys have never done a values exercise, or there's one in our resources page, I believe. Or if you aren't aware of your values yourself, if you aren't aware of somebody else's, what's important to them, you know, it may feel kind of weird, but maybe ask them, or at least consider. Take a moment in the next lesson to consider how well you know them and evaluate if you've ever had that discussion. All right, so baby steps, right? If there's anything that stood out to you today as you watched this video, if there were any of the elements where you're like, you know what, I may not do so great there. That's okay. That's what this is all about, just improving. I don't want to shame you guys if any of these elements you can relate to and you're pretty out of balance. The whole point is you're here to improve. So pick something that is super tiny, and I mean super tiny. Like, I'm just, going to make sure that I tell my assistant what I appreciate about them this week. Whatever it might be, whatever feels right to you. And if you can't think of something, or if you have a really good idea, go share it or ask your questions at the Hodges Leadership Institute LinkedIn page. Lots of people are there to help you. I am there to help you. Associate coaches are there to help you. We all want to see you thrive through this program. So next week, empathy. Again, it's out of touch versus tuned in, critical versus encouraging, narcissistic versus an attitude of service, a culture of fear versus collaboration. It's a really nice module. I think it's going to be a little bit of a shorter one, so it's because it's a little quick. It's easy to explain. So tune in for that. But until then, start thinking about these different elements of team leadership and see which ones maybe you are looking forward to personally because it's one you know that you need to work on. And there's nothing wrong with that. In summary, leading requires feeling. It requires talking about feelings, tuning into each other. And we're going to talk more about the theory of the triune brain and how why feeling in order to, why in order to get the best brain performance from your staff, you need to empathize and you need to feel with them. But so if you take nothing else away from today but this, remember that leading, really good leading that elevates a culture, makes everyone feel safe, requires feeling. Thanks so much, and I will see you next week.